Hi everyone, welcome back to The Female Athlete, powered by Coach Parry. My name is Haley Nixon and we'll be joining Shona Hendricks today for a really important conversation, probably a little bit more subjective than factual based, but that is, what can we do if we are unable to have these important, maybe female discussions with our coaches? So I hope you'll stick around to join us. It should be a really good conversation. Thank you, Shona, for your time. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe below to make sure that you receive notifications on when we put out our next video, and stay tuned for a really important conversation today. Hello, Shones. Welcome back. Always good to chat with you. And today we're going to have a really interesting conversation, and I think it's going to be more subjective chat and maybe more emotional chat than really fact-based. But the question we wanted to pose to you was, what do you do if you have a coach who isn't willing or is uncomfortable with having conversations that are quite female-specific, for example, the menstrual cycle or menopause?
Yeah, what a great question. I think and we've been coming at it from the other angle and saying how important all of these things are. But if you can't even broach a subject with the person who's adapting all your training, that is such an important concept to discuss. And I think, I think there'll be a difference necessarily between someone who's maybe just starting their period and as a young athlete versus all the way to the extreme of how we'd go with an elite athlete. We can dive a little bit more into that here today.
Yeah. And I think it's not, just to be upfront, it's not gender specific. I think females have as much difficulty talking about these things with other females as maybe a male coach would with females. But I also know as a young athlete, I found it really difficult to tell my coach. My swimming coach was a female coach. I was even a little bit embarrassed to tell her. And then certainly as an older athlete, it was a discussion that I never had with my male coaches. So we're not being gender specific. But as you say, Shona, there's pros, well, not pros and cons, but there's difficulty as a young athlete versus a senior athlete. As a young athlete, you might still be quite nervous around the subject of having your menstrual cycle. But as an older athlete, you might feel like, oh, I'm old enough to know what's going on here. It's going to be a bit awkward if I have to bring this up with my coach now. So yeah, like you say, how do we handle the whole age spectrum as well?
Yeah, exactly. I think, we mentioned this once before. It's around normalizing this conversation. So first up, if we can realize that a woman's physiology is different, and so we have to, that's point number one. And number two, then, well, if it is different, then it's going to be having a different effect on training. And so, if we're not having these conversations and normalizing that, then we're not going to be optimizing training for the female athlete. So I think that's the first point. And whether that, so from a young athlete who's just starting her period all the way through to an elite, it's about how broaching that topic a little bit differently. So, it wouldn't necessarily just sort of blurt out with your young athlete, how are you feeling on your period? You might be a little bit more sensitive about coming up to that topic as opposed to, with an elite athlete, perhaps who has a bit more experience with these things to then broach that a bit differently. But yeah, I think normalizing that conversation is first and foremost, and again, not being gender specific, but male coach down to female athletes and vice versa. I just think that is such an important conversation to be having.
Yeah, sure. And I think also just like who is responsible. So I think at the end of the day, the buck always lands on the athlete. Like you're in control of you ultimately. But I do believe there's a level of responsibility for the coach to make themselves available for those conversations. So, one thing we discussed within our federation was if we feel like there are some coaches, and if I could broadly term them old school or just maybe conservative, and we know and we can understand there's no way that coach is going to have that discussion, with his female athletes, then possibly the option of having a mediator, having someone put in place who is the team manager or is a trusted parent. Maybe it's a doctor, because sometimes people feel more comfortable in front of a doctor. So you put someone in place who can have those conversations with the young girls, with the older elite athletes. Because I know in my experience, we were told, I was probably in my early 20s. So that's quite late already. Don't have your period on race day. I don't want to hear that. And that was the whole discussion, finished in class. And you think, well, okay, so how do I deal with that? And that probably wasn't the best advice or the best handled situation from a coach to an athlete. But I'm sure that happens a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to put a whole bunch of stress on your athlete that they can't control, right? But no, exactly. I think I've had a few of these conversations with other coaches, and that concept of perhaps mediating, I do think that is definitely definitely an option. And in some of the conversations I've actually had with Lindsay, Coach Perry himself, it's exactly that. I mean, male coach coaching female athletes, but he, instead of choosing the mediator route, he's chosen to perhaps educate himself and understand the effect it has. So, I think that's also really important, is to, for the athlete to maybe take that onto themselves, and say, actually, I really struggle when I'm in this part of my cycle for my high intensity sessions, and then working together to try and find a way around that. But yeah, I guess if there's no, again, it would come back to my beginning points. If we're not normalizing that conversation and understanding the effects it does have, I think we're going to struggle to get around that in the long term. So I'm really glad we're having these conversations quite frankly and quite openly, because more and more people need to be doing this. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to optimize the training effects for females.
Yeah, and I think you hit a good point there. Like, what we've also learned and what we also see and know from chatting with friends, and every female experiences that whole cycle individually. So some will have a heavier bleed than others. Some will bleed for more days than others. Some will have excessive cramps, debilitating cramps. In my personal experience, I've always been very light on the side of PMS symptoms, as you want to call it, and things like that. So it's quite easy for me to manage it. So now, if that's the perspective I take as a coach towards my athletes, then I'm going to wonder why everyone's being paranoid and such a hypochondriac. It's only your period. Meanwhile, I don't know the experience that athlete's having. So again, as you say, if we can normalize it and be able to be open and say, well, yeah, coach, I bleed for 5 days and it's really heavy, or I don't, then at least we get handled as individuals and not all stuck into, well, why can't you be like Hayley and just have it light? I think you're exaggerating. And that's not fair either.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. No,
carry on.
Spot on. I think, the other flip side of that coin is to then also say, well, I'm on my period, I can't do anything, so that's fine. But then what happens in race week? So if that's race week, and, you have to start understanding, well, okay, if I'm really struggling and I've got bad symptoms, what can I do to mitigate that, or to almost try to succumb to, well, not succumb to them, but almost help sort some of those symptoms out, because you might get your period in race week. So again, just changing the tabooness of it. So if we're talking and learning and educating ourselves around it a little bit more, like you're saying, with all the different coaches, they can say, well, Hayley does this, and so Shona, maybe you try to do this within your sort of race week, or when you are experiencing very heavy symptoms. Yeah, I think there's so much that can be done, because it's about empowering, right, athletes and coaches to make sure that we're not just giving women less and we're optimizing their training, but we're also not just putting them to the side.
We're just, sweeping it under the rug and choosing not to talk about it, like stick your head in the sand. And maybe that also brings us back to female mentors. So we kind of need our older athletes to step forward and say, hey, how can I help? This is what I dealt with. Because if the younger athletes see the older athletes as sharing and, like you say, not associating a bit of taboo with it, then it's like, oh, well, it's okay because my swimming hero, Penny Haynes, speaks about it openly. So then I'll feel better about speaking about it openly, or, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is hugely important. Obviously, it leads us into conversations we've had on contraception and things like that. But yeah, if you need to have those conversations with a young athlete because that's going to help them with their sporting career, and not because you're trying to, promote safe sex, then, they need to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think your point on the heroes or the mentors is so vital. I mean, we had that female athlete webinar, and Anne Ashworth was on there, and she was speaking, she gave so much insight into around her learnings as a female athlete and her experience with Red S. And, so my advice to young athletes would be then to find female athletes who are speaking about this openly, because you also don't want to find a mentor who's saying not getting your period is the way to go, so find the right kind of mentor, find someone who's open to having these conversations, because there's so much that can be learned from that.
And and then maybe like one thing is just to say to the coaches, just try and empower yourselves. Try and not be so nervous about the conversation. It's probably not going to be as hard as you think it is. And then maybe also just to admit it, if you can't, try and help yourself, because it'll be easier for you to deal as the coach, I would imagine, if you know what's going on with your athlete individually, then also just like pulling the wool out of your own eyes.
Yep, spot on. I second that.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Shones. It's good to touch on something that's a bit emotional and maybe a little bit subjective, but I think equally important in order for us to put like all these pieces together to really train optimally as a female. So Thanks for your time. And once again, I'm sure this will come up again. So we'll live and learn.
Awesome. Thanks, Hels. Yeah, always good chatting to you.
Thank you so much for joining us today as we discussed how better to have these conversations with our coaches when perhaps these are slightly awkward or uncharted conversations. Please make sure you've subscribed to our channel so you receive notifications for the next video. And there are a host of videos available if you'd like to watch more in-depth seminars. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you again. Bye.